Exodus chapter 19. Admittedly, we could preach an entire sermon on each one of the Ten Commandments. That is not what I'm about to do. Rather, I want to sort of work our way through. We'll actually cover very quickly, relatively speaking, from Exodus 19 to Exodus 32. And so in this series, Portraits of Christ, we've been moving our way through the Bible very much faster than we would if we were going to preach the book of Exodus a verse at a time, obviously. And so the whole idea there is to not so much hone in on each one of the Ten Commandments. As I say, each of them could be a sermon themselves, but rather to see how it is that the law of God works and works itself out amongst the people of God. And so with that aim, Exodus chapter 19, so that at least we get a little bit of context. So we were last week in Exodus 17, and Israel had tested the Lord, and that was not a great idea. After that, they get into their first bit of combat. That happens. Then Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, has some good advice for him, and so he gives him that in chapter 18, and then we come to chapter 19. On the third new moon, after the people of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. So they've set out from Rephidim, verse 2, and came into the wilderness of Sinai. And they encamped in the wilderness. There Israel encamped before the mountain, while Moses went up to God. The Lord called to him out of the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob," or to the house of Israel, "and tell the people of Israel." This is what you're supposed to tell them, Moses. Verse 4. "You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, what I, God, did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you, Israel, on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself." Brought you out of Egypt, called you out of Egypt, brought you to myself. Verse 5, "Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." Now, if you're tracking with that just structurally, God reminds the people of what he did in saving them, and that which is to say, he has saved them by grace, and now here comes the law. It's, I've saved you by grace, now obey me. So I'm just pointing that out. Verse 7, "So Moses came and called the elders of the people and set before them all these words that the Lord had commanded him. And all the people answered together and said, 'All that the Lord has spoken, we will do.' And Moses reported the words of the people to the Lord. And the Lord said to Moses, 'Behold, I am coming to you in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with you, and may also believe you forever.'" In the following verses, Moses gets the people prepared for that meeting where God will come down onto Mount Sinai in the form of a cloud and speak his law to Moses and in the hearing of the people. We jump down to verse 16. 3 days to prepare. "On the morning of the third day," verse 16, Exodus 19, "there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast, so that all the people in the camp trembled. Then Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they took their stand at the foot of the mountain. Now Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord had descended on it in fire. The smoke of it went up like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled greatly. And as the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him in thunder. The Lord came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up." Now, if you're keeping score at home, Moses will go up and down this mountain 7 different times. And if you understand the picture, it's a frightening picture. The Lord said to Moses, "Go down and warn the people." Here's the frightening part, as if that wasn't enough. "Go down and warn the people, lest they break through to the Lord to look and many of them perish. Also, let the priests who come near to the Lord consecrate themselves, lest the Lord break out against them." And Moses said to the Lord, "The people cannot come up to Sinai, for you yourself warned us, saying, set limits around the mountain and consecrate it. And the Lord said to him, go down and come up, bringing Aaron with you. But do not let the priests and the people break through to come up to the Lord, lest he break out against them. So Moses went down to the people and told them, God is holy. That's the takeaway. Now, from our series in Hebrews, I preached 2 sermons, something like Between Two Mountains, contrasting how the preacher to the Hebrews grabs the imagery of Mount Sinai and compares it to the imagery of Mount Zion. You can go listen to those sermons. I'm not going to spend any time on that right now. I simply want you to understand the setting of what's happening. So are you tracking with this? So God and Moses are up on the mountain and the people are down on the mountain and below. And God has set a boundary and said, don't come up here because I'm holy and you're not. And if you come up here, you'll die. I'll break out against you. And so the holiness of God is a terrifying and ferocious holiness. And what God is explaining out of the thick cloud and in all of this imagery is I am not like you. I am not like you. And then he begins to speak these words, Exodus 20 and verse 1. And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord. What's that word? I am the Lord, your God. I am the Lord, your God. Translation, we are in covenant relationship. That's what that means. If God is your God, then what that means is that you and he are in covenant relationship. Now, you have to ask yourself at this point, how is it that these people are in covenant relationship with God? How is it that these people can say, God is my God? How is that? And the answer comes at the end of the sentence. Who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery? So if you're tracking structurally, it's very similar to the words of chapter 19. I am the Lord, your God. I am in covenant relationship with you, and I am the one, God says, who set out to bring about the relationship. And I have brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, and I've brought you to myself because you are my people, and I am your God. We are in covenant relationship together by grace, and now obey me. Verse 3. And here come the 10 Commandments. And now you'll notice that from Exodus 20 to 32, we essentially have 12 chapters of law. The 10 Commandments are the famous ones that we sort of remember, but there are 613 total laws that God gives to his people. I think you could think about it like this. I haven't thought this all the way out yet, so I got to put a little more thought into it. But I think you could think of it like this. God gives the 10 Commandments, and then all of the other laws for Israel are essentially case studies or outworkings of those 10 Commandments. They would be like the 10 Commandments applied to all of these various situations. Now, you can think that one out, but what we have here, and what we'll spend our time doing pretty briefly here this morning, is we're not going to go through all 613. We're going to go through 10, and we're going to go through 10 very, very quickly. First commandment, verse 3, Exodus 20. You shall have no other gods before me. No other gods before me. Said another way, don't love anything or anyone, including yourself, more than you love me. I think Martin Luther said this, and I believe he was right when he did, that you cannot break any of the other 9 commandments without first breaking the first commandment of have no other gods before me. Commandment number 2. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. Don't make any graven images. That's commandment number 2. And the whole idea, it seems to me, behind making a graven image is to get God down onto your level, right? Yeah, God, you're up in Sinai and you dwell in a cloud, and when you talk, we feel like we're going to die. But what we'll do is we'll just carve an image of something. Isaiah does a beautiful job of talking through the utter foolishness of idolatry. We'll make you manageable. We'll make you eye level. We will take something that you, the Creator, have created, and we will worship the creation rather than you, the Creator. Don't do that, commandment number 2. Commandment number 3, verse 7, do not take my name in vain. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Now, there's a bunch of ways to think about taking the Lord's name in vain. Obviously, we ought not make his name into a curse word, which some people do. We ought not say, and this became so clear to me actually as I was studying for this sermon, we ought not say so flippantly as many of us do, oh my God. Oh my God. Did you hear what happened? Oh my God. That is something that we ought not do. And we ought not do that because honestly, the framing of the two words and putting them together, my God, is two of the most beautiful realities that could ever come together. Verse 2, I am the Lord your God. And I am your God because I came after you and delivered you and saved you by grace. And so what we ought to say is my God with tremendous reverence on our lips and flowing out of our hearts because he has done all of the things necessary to make it to where we can say my God. And we ought not then say so flippantly at the thought of what the score was yesterday or what the weather's going to be tomorrow or any other event, oh my God. But taking the Lord's name in vain, while certainly would exclude the flippant saying of his name, using his name as a curse word, actually has more to it than that. The deeper understanding of that is that we ought not represent God's name wrongly. Now you have to remember how name is used in the Bible, because it's not an identifier only. It is that, but it's not only that, but rather name has to do with reputation and resume and glory and weight and majesty. And so it is that we, the people of God, ought to carry ourselves in such a way as to reveal that we are in covenant relationship with Yahweh. Number 4, keep the Sabbath. Now, as you trace out the idea of keeping the Sabbath throughout the New Testament, and as it unfolds in redemptive history, keeping the Sabbath is less about keeping a particular day of the week and more about the idea of rest and worship. In other words, if God rested from the 6 days of creation on the seventh day and continues to rest, then the implications of that are monumental. It means that we ought to rest from our working and striving and trying to earn God's favor and rest in Christ, who is our Sabbath. That's true. It also means that we ought to take a day out of our week to rest and to worship. And to not take a day out of the week to rest and to worship indicates a lot of problems in us, one of which is we have obviously not learned how to trust God. Remember when bread called manna meaning what is it, comes down from heaven? Remember God's instruction? You collect the what is it, the manna, you collect that on 6 days, and then you trust God to make the 6 days provision sufficient for the seventh day. And the whole idea there is you need to trust God, not your work ethic, to make ultimate provision for you. Now, that doesn't mean that you be lazy and don't collect on the other 6 days, because if you don't do that, you're going to be really hungry. But it does mean that after you put in the work through the first 6, you trust God to provide in the seventh. If you feel or believe or are being pressured to that you need to work your tail off all 7 days, you are not trusting in God. That's the principle of rest and worship. And so we rest on a day in order to worship our God. Number 5, honor your father and mother, verse 12. Honor your father and mother. Now again, obviously I'm flying through here, but the clear implications there are children need to learn how to respect the God-wrought, God-ordained authority that he has placed in their lives in the form of their parents. And if they can do that, then those children will be set up pretty well to then operate under all the other forms of authority that God has brought about in their lives, like teachers, for example, and police officers, and government authorities, and different relationships within the home, and different relationships within the church. And so the family is this core building block unit for society to flourish, and it begins with children honoring and respecting their father and their mother. So we're through the first 5. I'm just curious how you think you're doing so far. I don't know if I need to tell you, or maybe some of you are just like, ooh, not going awesome so far. In fact, after 1, it was just a dumpster fire. Yes, that is exactly what the 10 Commandments are meant to do. I'll get more to that in a second. Number 6, don't murder. You're like, well, Alex, the first 5 weren't great, but I have not murdered anyone. Be careful, because when Jesus walks down into humanity in the form of a man, he says, you've heard don't murder, and that's true, but anybody who's been angry or hated their brother in their heart is guilty of murder. So we're in trouble on that one. Number 7, don't commit adultery. Again, we'll hand the mic to Jesus. You've heard don't commit adultery, but I say to you, anyone who looks upon a woman or a man with lust in their heart is guilty of adultery. Okay, not so great. Let's move on. Don't steal. Yep, we all are in trouble on that one. That's verse 15. Verse 16, don't lie. And if you say that you have not, then we know that you have broken the 9th commandment. Number 10, don't covet. Verse 17, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his servants, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. His truck, his job, his status. So those are the 10 Commandments. And then from there, now Moses is up on the mountain still. God reveals these things. Seems to me, as I've studied it out, seems to me as though the people can hear these words being spoken to Moses. It's like they can hear down on the mountain this conversation going on. We keep reading. Laws about slaves, restitution. And then God comes in chapter 24, which you'll turn over there with me. God comes in Exodus chapter 24, verse 3. Moses came and told the people of Israel all the words of the Lord and all the rules. And all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words that the Lord has spoken, we will do. He rose early in the morning and built an altar, because now we're going to worship at the foot of the mountain, 12 pillars, according to the 12 tribes of Israel. And he sent young men of the people of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen to the Lord. Verse 6, and Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins, and half of the blood he threw against the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant, which would be the law that he had just received from God, and he read it in the hearing of the people. And they said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do, and we will be obedient. And Moses ratified the covenant with blood. Behold the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. And then a very interesting thing happens, almost as an aside, but you have to understand this for where we're going. Look with me at Exodus 24 and verse 14. Moses says to the elders, wait here for us is me and Joshua, wait here for us until we return to you. And behold, Aaron and Hur are with you. Whoever has a dispute, let him go to them. Then Moses went up on the mountain. So he's headed back up there. And the cloud covered the mountain, and the glory of the Lord dwelt on Mount Sinai. And the cloud covered it 6 days. And on the 7th day he called to Moses out of the midst of the cloud. Now the appearance of the glory of the Lord was like a devouring fire on the top of the mountain in the sight of the people of Israel. Moses entered the cloud and went up on the mountain, and Moses was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. And then he hears about contributions to the sanctuary and the Ark of the Covenant and the table of bread and the golden lampstand and how to build the tabernacle and how all of that's going to go. And these are, unfortunately for so many of us, just flyover verses if we even read them, but they are all significant because they reveal the holiness and you could even say the particular holiness of God. And so Moses is up on the mountain receiving all of this. And you fast forward to Exodus 32. And you all don't say amen very often, but I do hear pages turn, and I'll take it. I just want to say how much I appreciate the sound of those pages turning as you follow along with me in the scriptures. That is a resounding amen in my ears, that you care more about what the word says than what I say. And so we look together at Exodus 32. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves to Aaron. The people. The everything you say will do people. Those people. Those ones. They go to Aaron, the priest, and say to him, "Up, make us," what's that word? Gods. "Make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." So Aaron said to them, "Remember the first commandment, no other gods." And Aaron said, "Far be it from me, your priest, to lead you into this sort of idol-worshiping rebellion and break the first commandment." That's actually not what he said, in case you haven't read it. Some of you are like, "Man, I like Aaron. Like, that was a stand-up thing he did." Nope, I made that one up. Here's what he actually said. "Take off the rings of gold that are in the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." Now ask yourself this question. How do a bunch of former slaves out in the wilderness get that kind of bling? They get it because God had given them favor with the Egyptians, and all of the Egyptians, as they're leaving, are like, "Hey, here's my rings and my gold, take it." And now they're taking the very thing that their slaveholders and oppressors had given to them as an act of blessing and favor from the Lord, and now they're going to make a god out of it. So the people took off the rings of gold that were in their ears and brought them to Aaron, and he received the gold from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool and made a golden calf. And they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." If it weren't for the fact that we are, if we're honest, so acquainted with the fickleness of our own hearts, that would almost seem unbelievable. "I am the Lord your God." Your God. I'm the Lord, I'm Yahweh, your God, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. 40 days later, see this golden thing here? This is the God who has brought us up out of the land of Egypt. Let's all worship it. Verse 7, "And the Lord said to Moses, go down." Now watch this. "Go down, for your people whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way that I commanded them. They have made for themselves a golden calf and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, 'These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt.' And the Lord said to Moses, 'I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, in order that I may make a great nation of you.'" And I would like for you to consider two conclusions. Number one, we can't save ourselves. We cannot save ourselves. God does not come to the children of Israel in bondage and slavery in Egypt and say, here are 10 commandments, obey them, and then I will come back in 6 months and rescue you if you have. If that was the Christian gospel, if that was the message of redemption, they would all die slaves in Egypt. We cannot save ourselves. And number 2, we were never meant to try. We were never meant to try. Do you know that there is this sort of shallow, poorly thought out version of religion, which is essentially what every other world religion is, which is basically God says, obey me, and if you will, I'll accept you. And so that is literally every version of religion that there is. Whatever the law is, whatever the test is, whatever the list is, just keep it, and then you will be accepted by God. That is not the Christian gospel. It is not the Christian gospel. We cannot save ourselves, and we're never meant to try. Now, I've said it, but let me show it to you. The Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 3, which I don't even need to tell you to turn there, but I just might. Romans chapter 3, Paul is going to look at Mount Sinai and give us some of the most helpful words and instruction about Sinai, about the law that we could ever hear. We cannot save ourselves, and we were never meant to try. We cannot save ourselves. Now, you might, because of the fact that you perhaps, are a bit more optimistic about your condition than you ought to be, you might say to yourself, well, if I was there and I heard the law and saw the shaking and the cloud and the trumpets and all that business, I wouldn't have worshipped the golden calf. I wouldn't have done that. To say that simply indicates the fact that you are not as familiar with your depravity as the Bible would reveal that you are. We are worse off. We are actually worse. We're worse than we think ourselves to be. Worse. We way overestimate our righteousness and way underestimate our depravity. We cannot save ourselves. We have not kept any of the 10 commandments. We cannot save ourselves, and we're never meant to try. Now let me show you that from Romans chapter 3. You're in verse 20. For by works of the law, no human being will be declared righteous in his sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin. So do you know what the law is meant to do for you? The law is meant to show you that you are broken, to show you that you're a sinner. In other words, the law of God is not a checklist by which you measure your righteousness. The law of God, I've historically explained it this way. It's an MRI. You go in, you're like, my leg hurts. MRI comes back. Yeah, you shattered your femur. You don't go back into the MRI, which is, they're horrible, by the way, because of Anyway, so you don't go back into the tube of death in order to have it then re-examined, like, hey, doc, throw me back in there because that'll fix the leg. No, the MRI reveals that something's wrong, but it cannot fix the problem. The law reveals that something is wrong with us. It cannot, in and of itself, fix the problem. Verse 21, but now, the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law. Although the law and the prophets bear witness to it, the righteousness of God, not through the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. So if the law cannot make me righteous, what then will make me righteous? Not my own efforts, but rather faith in Jesus Christ. For there is no distinction. Verse 23, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. All have made graven images. All have loved themselves more than they love God. All have lusted and lied and cheated and failed to honor their parents. All of us. All have sinned, and yet all who come to Christ, verse 24, are justified by His grace as that word is gift. Gift. by his grace as a gift through the redemption. Now that word redemption, that's Exodus language. That's Passover language. That's God has heard your cry, seen your plight, and brought you, purchased you, bought you by blood out of slavery. Slavery then in Egypt, and slavery now to bondage in sin. Verse 25, Jesus, whom God put forward as a propitiation, that is to say, a sacrifice that bears the wrath of God and replaces it with favor. A sacrifice that bears the wrath of God and replaces it with favor. Remember that fascinating little conversation that God and Moses have? Where God's like, those people, those ones that you brought out of Egypt, those ones, just give me a second, because I'm going to sit here and burn hot in my wrath and in my anger, and then I'm going to break out and remove them. I am going to eliminate them, and we're going to start over again. God put forward Jesus as a propitiation by his blood, which means that God broke out in wrath against not the people, but Jesus on the cross. Where he poured out all of his wrath on Jesus, all of the curse that our sins require on Jesus. And then Jesus, as that perfect sacrifice, absorbs the wrath and then turns the wrath into favor for the people of God. This was to show God's righteousness, because in his divine forbearance, he had passed over former sins. So just so you know, God does not break out and kill all of the nation of Israel for worshiping the golden calf. He does not do that. You know what he does instead? He passed over their sins in his divine forbearance. It was to show his righteousness at the present time so that he might be, now these are some of the most important words in all the Bible, that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. How is it that God can look down upon a people who are as idolatrous as that? Have no other gods before me. Everything you've said we'll do. Hey, Aaron, Moses has been gone a while. Let's make a god and let's bow down and worship it. And then let's have the audacity to tell to all the people that it is this little shiny golden calf that brought us out of Egypt, not God. How is it that God can be just and not absolutely light that people up? Here's the answer. In his divine forbearance, he has passed over their former sins, and he stored up the wrath that their sins deserved so that he could pour it out on the one perfect man ever to live, namely Jesus Christ. That's how. So that is how God can remain just, because he pours out his wrath that we deserve on Jesus, and still justify wicked sinners like you and like me. Wicked idolaters like you and like me. Wicked men and women who have loved other gods and chased after other lusts and told lies and done all of those things. So the law of God is not a checklist that we then try to keep and improve upon year over year, hoping that somehow, when it all comes down and we're measured out on the scales, our good can outweigh our bad. That is not the point of the law. The point of the law is to point us to the absolute scandal that someone else came and lived the life we could not live, died the death that we deserved to die, drank the white-hot cup of the wrath of God to the very dregs, so that we can have all of his favor and none of his justice. So, that must then bring us to the conclusion, if we look back on Exodus 20, that must bring us then to the conclusion that obedience no longer matters, right? Because if Jesus fulfilled the law perfectly and God doesn't measure me against the 10 Commandments, but rather sees me in Christ, then obedience must then be unimportant. Wrong. Let me make 4 quick observations about the use of the law, the importance of obedience now for those of us who have placed our faith into Jesus Christ. Number 1, freedom. A word about freedom. once you have placed your faith into Jesus Christ, the law will bring about obedience to the clear revealed commands of God, will bring about freedom like nothing else can bring. Jesus says in John 8, anyone who sins is a slave to sin. So in other words, it's not just that the children of Israel have a slavery problem and then it ended once they got out of Egypt. No, they had a slavery problem outside of them, only to then realize that now they have a slavery problem inside of them. Inside of them. It is not Pharaoh who said, hey, here's a bunch of gold earrings, go make a god and worship it. Pharaoh didn't say that. Pharaoh is dead at the bottom of the Red Sea somewhere. They said that out of their own heart. And so they are now realizing, and we must realize, we are slaves to sin. And certainly, we must run to Christ to be set free from sin. But then, as we run to Christ, we flee from sin. We flee from sin headlong into urgent, gospel-driven, grace-filled obedience. So the law is there. The obedience to Christ is there in order for us to walk in greater levels of freedom. It is not wrong to say, God, everything you say we'll do. Like, would to God that there were more Christians who would look at the book and say, God, everything you say we'll do. My life, God, doesn't even matter. It's just whatever you tell me to do, I'll do it. And what that will do is increase levels of freedom in your life like you've never known. Freedom. Number 2, joy. God, in His grace, has revealed to us how the world that He made works. If you want joy, hear and heed His voice in how it is that He has designed the world to work. We could go around the room, we won't, but we could go around the room, and who in here has a regret? And probably everybody raises their hands. If you didn't raise your hand, it's because you're asleep. So who in here has a regret? Okay, now take whatever that regret is and ask yourself, if I had been obeying God as He reveals Himself in His Word, would I have that regret? In most all instances of serious regret, serious shame, serious brokenness, serious sorrow, the answer is no. Now, I'm not saying all of them, but I'm saying that there is a joy in operating within the bounds of, say, sex, or in the bounds of authority, or in the bounds of worship, or in the bounds of materials. There's so much, not only freedom, but also joy in obeying God, because after all, He created the world. He knows how it works. If you want joy, obey Him. So freedom, joy. Number 3, glory. Here's Jesus in Matthew 5. In the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. If you have bowed the knee to the King of glory, then what you are supposed to do is obey Him, so that as you obey Him, other people see what you're doing and don't give you glory, but give Him glory. God receives glory through the obedience of His people. That's how that works. We are to be bright and light in a dark world and obey in such a way as to be so Christ-centered and Christ-exalting to where we obey and people glorify Jesus. Which brings us to number 4. Not only do we obey for freedom and for joy and for glory, but we obey, number 4, for the sake of the mission. You remember that back in Exodus 19, God says, I brought you out of Egypt. I bore you up on eagle's wings. Now obey me, obey my covenant, and you will be my treasured possession among all peoples, plural, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. God says, I brought you out of Egypt, I brought you to myself, and now I will place you under my sovereign grace among the peoples, plural, so that those peoples, plural, will see that you are a kingdom of priests. Do you know what a priest does? A priest takes people who are far from God and brings them near to God. That's what priests do. Jesus Christ is our great high priest who has taken people far from God and brought them in near, but then He sends us back out into the world to be a kingdom of priests. We'll get more to this in 1 Peter, but a kingdom of priests who take people who are far from God and bring them near. It has always been a marked distinction of the people of God from the world that makes that people useful to the world. Like when you study out the law and the way that God reveals it in Exodus, in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, the whole idea there is I want you to be different from the surrounding people so that it is your distinctiveness, your difference, you could say salt and light that makes you so different from the rest of the world so that the rest of the world looks in on you and goes, they're different than us. There was a really bad failed experiment in the 90s where the church, where the whole idea was you have these so-called intelligent human beings, leaders within the church, who come up with an idea that says we will take more ground in our culture and in a lost and dying world by being more like the world rather than being like Christ. And so this whole idea, this whole movement of seeker-sensitive churches where the whole idea is gather together and make this place as appealing to unbelievers as we possibly can. It was a failed experiment. And if we're not careful, it seems to me that we are endeavoring to do it once again, where we need to be as much like the world as we possibly can, and then maybe once they accept us, we can tell them about Jesus. That is not what salt and light is. Light is light because the world is dark. Salt is salt and slows decay and has a particular taste to it, and that's what we are called to be. We're called to live lives marked by obedience to Jesus and repentance. But please don't hear me saying that means that whoever said it, it's attributed to a couple of different people, but preach the gospel, always use words when necessary. I'm not advocating for that. You might be a good person, and your neighbor might think you to be a good person, and might even know that you go to church. But if you do not open your lips and proclaim the gospel to your neighbor, they will die and go to hell thinking that you're a good person. That's not a win for anybody. So I'm not advocating for that. What I'm trying to advocate for is the biblical notion and the biblical idea that those who have been purchased out of bondage and slavery by our great Passover Lamb, Jesus Christ, the law fulfiller, are now sent back out into the world to live lives of radical, grace-filled, gospel-centered obedience to our great King. And as we live lives like that is the way we live our lives, and yet continually on our lips is the greatest news in all the world called the gospel, that God saw fit to, from his holy mountain, walk down into the dirt and scum and depravity of this world, take on human flesh, live a perfect life, die a horrible death, and rise victoriously 3 days later, so that by faith in him, his perfect righteousness can be credited to us forever. That message, the gospel, must be on our lips, and the righteousness that God has called us to and modeled for us in Christ must be manifest in our lives. God, help us to that end. Father, would you do that work in us? God, that if there is anyone here who thinks that righteousness can be earned or bought by their behavior, God, would you, by your Spirit, and through your preached word, would you cause them to throw off any hope that they could ever save themselves? And God, would they run and fling themselves upon Jesus? And yet, God, in that, as we, the church, have trusted in your Son and have been brought out of slavery and bondage to sin and death, God, will we be a church and a people marked by obedience? And as we're marked by obedience, might we experience ever-increasing freedom from sin and ever-increasing joy and, God, ever-increasing glory for your name as people see our good deeds and glorify you. And God, that all of that would flow into the sake of the mission, that more and better disciples would be made. As we live the lives you've called us to live and look so distinct from the world that they cannot help, but as Peter says, but ask for the hope. Ask us about the hope that is within us, and that we would with our lips proclaim from the rooftops, the hope is Christ. We pray these things in his name. And the church said,